When Clint Eastwood showed up at a star-studded benefit concert in Los Angeles, no one expected him to steal the spotlight, least of all Jasper Quinn, a sharp-tongued indie musician known for mocking Hollywood legends. Armed with arrogance and a microphone, Jasper thought he'd make a joke at Clint's expense. What he didn't know was that Clint wasn't just there to listen, he was there to play. And what followed wasn't a comeback, it was a quiet masterclass. Because in true Clint Eastwood fashion, he didn't raise his voice. He let the music, and the silence that followed, do all the talking. The green room hummed with quiet chaos, high ceilings, velvet curtains, trays of champagne flutes glinting under golden light. It was the kind of backstage space built to impress the already impressive. LA's elite filtered in and out, Oscar winners, platinum artists, foundation heads in tailored tuxedos and sequined gowns. But Jasper Quinn didn't blend in. He leaned against the baby grand in the corner, boots scuffed, sleeves rolled, cigarette tucked behind his ear like a relic from a cooler decade. His name had been all over the news lately, not for an album, but for a viral speech he'd made torching politicians, billionaires, and what he called performative patriotism. Tonight he was performing for a cause he actually believed in, mental health resources for veterans. But his sharp edge hadn't dulled. He scanned the room like a wolf in a tux. A familiar producer waved from across the room. Someone from a streaming platform tried to pitch him a docuseries idea between sips of Prosecco. Jasper nodded vaguely, uninterested. Then the door opened. He didn't notice at first. The crowd had parted subtly, instinctively, like a tide shifting around something heavy. Clint Eastwood stepped inside. No entourage, no fanfare, just a black blazer, pressed jeans, and that unmistakable steel-eyed calm. He moved through the room like he owned the silence, a quiet gravity that pulled eyes whether he wanted them or not. Jasper straightened up slowly, his eyes narrowing. "What's he doing here?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. A nearby stylist leaned in. "He's the surprise speaker, something about honoring vets." Jasper's jaw flexed. He didn't say anything right away, just watched as Eastwood shook hands with a few organizers, offering that trademark squint grin hybrid that somehow said both nothing and everything. It wasn't that Jasper hated the man, he just didn't buy the myth. The grizzled gunslinger turned director, turned cultural icon. Jasper had tweeted once, "If silence is strength, Clint Eastwood must be benching planets." It got 90,000 likes. Tonight, the man behind the myth was 30 feet away, and Jasper, ever the provocateur, could already feel the itch, the urge to push, to poke, to see what would happen when stone met fire. Jasper didn't wait long. He took a swig from his water bottle, turned to the group beside him, and said just loud enough, "So who booked the cowboy?" Was Chuck Norris busy? A few laughs, nervous ones. The kind people give when they're not sure if it's okay to laugh, but they don't want to look uptight either. Jasper grinned anyway, riding the ripple like a wave. Across the room, Clint Eastwood turned his head slowly. Not fast enough to seem bothered, just enough to say, "I heard you." Their eyes met for a flicker of a second, unmoving, unblinking, unequal. Clint's expression didn't change. His face, carved by time and sun and half a century of stoic roles, remained unreadable. But the weight of it, how he just stood there, still as stone, was louder than any comeback. Jasper raised an eyebrow, waiting for a reaction. None came, so he doubled down. "I mean, don't get me wrong," he continued, now speaking to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone. "I respect the classics, but maybe next time we let someone under 90 speak for the future." A few heads turned. An assistant near the catering table winced. A singer from a pop trio looked down into her drink, unsure whether she should be seen near either man. But Jasper wasn't done. The room was too quiet now, the attention too good to waste. "Don't worry, I'm sure he's got a speech lined up," he said, grinning like a fox. "Just hope it's not in Morse code." This time, Clint took a step forward. Just one. And it was enough to make the room inhale in unison. Still, he didn't speak, just looked. A steady, calculated gaze like he was reading a weather pattern Jasper couldn't see. Then, calmly, he walked toward the piano. Jasper's smirk faltered just a fraction. Clint stopped beside the bench, rested his fingers on the edge. He didn't sit, didn't speak. Just glanced at Jasper once, then down at the keys, then back again. A quiet challenge. No threat, no drama, just presence. Jasper scoffed, but his pulse betrayed him. He'd come looking for a sparring match, but something told him this wasn't going to be the fight he expected. Jasper tilted his head, eyes flicking toward the baby grand, tucked into the corner of the green room like some forgotten ornament. The lid was closed, the bench untouched. Polished ebony and ivory, waiting for relevance. He smirked. "Tell me, Clint," he said, loud enough for the words to land, soft enough to feel casual. "Can you do more than growl and squint? Ever actually create anything?" A pause. The chatter in the room slowed, shoulders subtly turning toward them. This wasn't just another celebrity squabble. This was theater. Clint didn't answer. Didn't need to. Jasper stood brushing invisible lint off his sleeve. "I mean, I know you've directed a few flicks, said some gruff stuff to empty chairs, but this is a benefit concert, article music. You ever dabble in that? Or is piano too woke for cowboys?" A soft laugh from someone by the drinks table, nervous, short-lived. Clint's eyes were on the piano now, not Jasper, not the crowd, just the keys. Jasper followed his gaze. The sight of the untouched instrument gave him a sudden spark of inspiration, the kind born of ego, dressed as cleverness. "Well," he said, gesturing toward the piano with mock courtesy, "how about you give us a tune? Something moody and minimalist? Or are you more of a shoot-the-piano player kind of guy?" Someone stifled a cough. A stylist shifted uncomfortably. The tension thickened, humming beneath the polite smiles and half-held flutes of champagne. Clint didn't move. Not yet. He stood there taking it all in, the room, the stairs, the arrogance. There was something ancient in the way he stood, like a statue built before people learned how to apologize. Jasper crossed his arms, cocked an eyebrow. "Well," he said, still smirking, "or has the man of 1,000 stairs finally run out of words?" Clint finally looked at him, just looked. No glare, no smile, just that unshakable, unreadable stillness that somehow made every nerve in the room sit up straight. Then, without a sound, he turned toward the piano, not in protest, not in pride, but like he was accepting a dare that had no business being made. Clint's boots moved slow across the carpet, the kind of slow that wasn't sluggish but deliberate, measured, like a man walking toward something sacred or haunted. Maybe both. He reached the piano and paused. One hand brushed the lid. It lifted with a soft click. The polished keys caught the light in uneven streaks, gleaming like teeth. He didn't sit, not yet, just stood there, a shadow against the instrument, the room behind him now utterly still. Nobody spoke. Even the air seemed to wait. Jasper dropped into a chair near the drinks table, legs crossed, arms folded, chin lifted like a judge waiting to deliver a verdict. He leaned back, putting on the look of someone unfazed, amused even. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something he wouldn't name. Clint slowly lowered himself onto the bench, not with effort, with weight. Like this seat wasn't just a chair, it was history, muscle memory. A moment he hadn't visited in years, but one he never forgot. The chatter was gone now, replaced by that heavy, humming quiet before a storm rolls in. Not loud, not fast, but undeniable. Someone near the hors d'oeuvres whispered, "Is he actually going to play?" No one answered. Jasper shifted, trying to maintain the smirk. Clint cracked his knuckles once. No drama, no performance, just the practical hands of a man who'd worked with tools, with film, with failure. Then he let his fingers hover over the keys, not touching, just remembering. And then he played, not loud, not flashy, just a slow, aching chord, minor with a suspended second, the kind of sound that doesn't shout. It settles, like dusk, like a memory. It hung in the room long after the keys lifted. Clint kept going, easing into a progression that felt older than the room itself, jazz tinged with blues, the notes shaped by smoke and ghosts and long-forgotten bars. Jasper didn't move. He didn't smirk. He didn't speak. Because whatever he had expected, this wasn't it. The relic he mocked was gone. And in his place sat a man who didn't need to prove a thing. He just needed to play. Clint placed both hands on the keys. No fanfare, no pretense, just quiet contact, skin to ivory, like an old handshake between two things that used to know each other well. The bench creaked slightly beneath him. His fingers hovered for half a second, then sank gently into the first chord. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. A slow, minor progression spilled into the air like smoke curling under a door, haunting and strangely familiar. The kind of sound you didn't hear so much as feel behind your ribs, behind your eyes. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. The small cluster of agents near the catering table went still, like they'd just walked into a church without meaning to. Jasper blinked. The first few notes weren't flashy, weren't showy. They were honest, just the bare sound of someone sitting with something unsaid for a long time and finally letting it out. He moved into a loose jazz rhythm, lilting, imperfect on purpose. It danced in and out of time, skipping like an old record. His left hand carried the weight, walking up the bass line, while the right painted shadows in the spaces between. Someone near the back muttered, "What is this?" No one answered. It was a melody from another life, one born in dim-lit bars with cigarette haze and low ceilings, a tune that wasn't written so much as remembered. Clint kept playing, eyes forward, posture loose. Nothing in his face betrayed effort. There was no performance in it, no hunger for attention, just a man in a room full of noise, using silence and sound to say what words couldn't. The kind of music that made people listen, not because they were told to, but because it asked them to feel something they hadn't in a while. Jasper sat frozen in his chair. He didn't reach for his phone, didn't crack another line. His smirk, once worn like armor, had slipped somewhere between the first chord and the fifth. Across the room, someone finally whispered, "I had no idea he could play." They weren't alone, because at that moment, it wasn't about Clint Eastwood, the actor or director or myth. It was about a man who hadn't lost his touch. He just never needed to show it. Until now. The melody deepened. Clint shifted seamlessly from jazz into something bluesier, more deliberate, like a slow drip from a leaky faucet in the middle of the night. Each note pressed just enough to ache, not rushed, not wasted. Every pause felt like a sentence he let hang in the air. And the room changed. Phones came out, yes, but even through lenses and screens there was reverence. No one dared speak over it. Even the clink of ice in glasses had vanished. Every ear tilted toward the piano, like it was telling secrets only music could decode. He wasn't just playing, he was communicating. Chord by chord, Clint pulled from some deep, dust-covered drawer of his past. There was history in his fingertips, years of silence, restraint, grit. You could hear the terrain of his life in the rhythm, desert winds, city lights, long pauses in between films, between choices. Every note was shaped by a man who'd seen things and never needed to talk about them. Until now. Then, just when it felt like he'd said all he needed, he surprised them again. The music shifted. From blues to something unexpected, classical but warm, not stiff or showy, like Chopin walked into a soul bar and sat down with the house band. The transition was fluid, clean, masterful. fingers gliding over the keys with the ease of someone who didn't play for praise, but because he couldn't not. Jasper leaned forward in his seat, no longer lounging. His mouth parted slightly like he meant to say something, maybe a joke, maybe a protest, but nothing came out. Clint didn't look at him, didn't need to. The music was doing all the talking, and Jasper wasn't laughing anymore. A quiet awe settled over the crowd, the kind that only comes when people realize they've underestimated someone, not by inches, by miles. A well-known producer mouthed to her assistant, "Get this on Instagram, now." But even through the cameras, no filter could touch what was happening. No hashtag could explain the shift in the room. Clint Eastwood, at 80-something years old, was reminding everyone, including a very humbled Jasper Quinn, what mastery looked like. Not loud, not forced, just undeniable. And it had always been there, waiting for someone foolish enough to challenge it. The music carried him back, not just Clint, but everyone listening. But somewhere behind the rhythm and restraint, there was a story in the notes, one only he remembered, one that never made the headlines or the film posters. Before the gunslinger roles, before the Oscars, before the legacy, there was a young man in San Francisco, fingers on a beat-up upright, in the corner of a smoky bar, a Marine dropout with more time than money, hungry to speak in a language the world hadn't yet taught him. Music had come before film. People didn't know that. Long before Dirty Harry or directing from behind the lens, Clint had spent nights hunched over piano keys in late-night clubs, trading chords with jazz drummers and sax players who wore their hearts on their sleeves, back when nobody knew his name. And he liked it that way. He didn't play for tips. He played because the silence in him needed somewhere to go. No script, no camera, just keys and instinct. There were nights in Oakland, Fresno, the back rooms of diners in Reno where the crowd didn't clap, just nodded slow when the notes hit right. He remembered those nights, the way they smelled, the way the cigarette smoke curled against the stage lights, the way the bass player always came in late on purpose, like it meant something. The music saved him, held him. It was the one thing in his life that didn't need to prove itself. It just was. And then came the movies. The world changed. He became a myth. But the piano never left him. It waited, like an old friend that didn't ask for much. Just that he'd come back once in a while and remember who he was before the world decided what he should be. Tonight, he remembered. And the room heard it. They didn't know why it felt like a confession or a sermon, but it did. Because Clint Eastwood, the icon carved in stone, was peeling back the layers without saying a word. Only the piano knew, and it told them everything. Jasper sat frozen, the sound of the piano bleeding into him like rain soaking through a cracked roof. Something in his chest was shifting, and he didn't know what to do with it. He'd come into the night armed and ready, witty barbs, loaded tweets, enough sarcasm to coat the room in irony. He was the rebel, the firebrand, the guy who never missed a chance to knock down a statue and build a soapbox in its place. But now he was listening to something he didn't have a name for. His fingers twitched in his lap. He hated how quiet he'd become. The worst part? He wasn't mad at Clint anymore. He was impressed. Reluctantly, silently, but undeniably. Each note peeled something back in him, a memory, a doubt, a long-ignored truth. He thought of his own early days, playing guitar in subway tunnels, chasing record deals with bloodshot eyes and a head full of resentment. His music had always come from pain, from a need to shout. But this was different. Clint wasn't shouting, he was telling, not loud, not flashy, just present, honest. It cut deeper. Jasper shifted again, suddenly self-conscious of his own voice, the one that had filled arenas, the one that was sharp enough to trend on Twitter and venomous enough to land a quote in Rolling Stone. For the first time in a long time, he wondered what it meant. He watched Clint's fingers move, effortless, weathered, sure. Not showmanship, craft. The kind you don't post, the kind you live with quietly for decades. Jasper's smirk was gone now, tucked somewhere between his doubt and his drink. The applause he once fed on felt hollow compared to the silence that now gripped the room. He looked down at his own hands, calloused, strong, but somehow unsteady now. For a split second, he imagined standing where Clint sat, and he knew he couldn't do what Clint was doing, not like this, not from that place. And that realization didn't make him angry. It made him reverent. The final chord lingered like the last light before dusk. Clint's fingers pressed into the keys with slow certainty. One note held longer than it needed to be, stretched just enough to ache. Not because he was unsure, because he knew exactly how long the moment could last before it broke. And then, gently, he lifted his hands. The room didn't erupt. It exhaled. There was no thunderous cheer, no standing ovation, just a deep, quiet wave of applause, measured and reverent. The kind of clapping people do when they know they've just witnessed something rare, and clapping too loud might scare it away. Heads turned to each other. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others just smiled softly, like they had been let in on a secret no one had expected Clint Eastwood to keep. He sat still for a moment longer. Then he rose, slow and steady. No bow, no flourish, just presence. He didn't look around for praise, he didn't soak it in. He wasn't a man performing, he was a man returning. And before stepping away from the piano, he looked at Jasper, not with smugness, not with challenge. Just a simple glance, quiet and clean. "It's all in the timing," Clint said, voice low but clear. Jasper didn't speak. Couldn't. The words hung in the air like smoke from a match that had just gone out. Clint walked away, past stunned faces and silent respect, the kind that can't be taught, only earned. He moved like a man who didn't need to win a moment to own it. He already had. And behind him the piano sat still, silent. But no one would forget the way it had just spoken. Jasper sat in his chair like someone had pulled the floor out from under him, and he hadn't quite landed yet. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, this time with a half-laugh that sounded more like a nervous cough. "Well," he said, glancing around for support, "that wasn't there. Guess I walked into that one." It didn't land. A few polite smiles flickered and faded. The room had changed, not in lighting or layout, but in energy. The gravity had shifted, and Jasper could feel it. It was like being handed the mic at your own concert, only to realize someone else had already sung the song, and better. He tried to lean back in his seat like he didn't care, like it didn't matter, but it did. And everyone knew it. A publicist whispered something to a client. A violinist who had barely made eye contact with Clint earlier now watched him walk away like she'd just seen a ghost wear a tux. Jasper looked down at his hands again. Same hands, but they felt different now, less certain, like they belonged to someone who had always thought he understood the room, until tonight. He glanced toward the piano. It sat quiet, innocent, but it felt like it was still echoing. Somewhere behind him, someone said, "Damn, that was wow." He couldn't even disagree. He just sat there, the former center of attention, now just another man in the crowd trying to make sense of a moment that didn't belong to him anymore. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, not tonight. And maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. The party carried on without them. Laughter echoed faintly down the hallway, bouncing off polished floors and framed posters of past concerts. Glasses clinked, deals were being made, and somewhere a publicist was probably still trying to spin Clint's impromptu performance into a viral headline. But none of that mattered here. Clint sat alone on a leather bench beneath a faded black and white photo of Miles Davis. One leg crossed over the other, hands resting calmly in his lap. The kind of stillness that didn't look forced, it looked earned. Jasper lingered at the end of the hallway, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve. He didn't know what he was doing there, only that he needed to be. Clint didn't look up when Jasper approached, but he knew. There was something about the man, always aware, like a tuning fork in a room full of static. Jasper cleared his throat softly. "Hey." Clint glanced up. No smirk, no edge, just a calm presence, like he'd been waiting for the moment to arrive on its own. Jasper sat down a few feet away, leaving space between them. That was... Jasper paused, searching for the right word, and realizing for once he didn't have one loaded. Unexpected. Clint chuckled softly, not in mockery, just amused by the honesty of it. "You don't last this long," he said, voice steady, "by doing just one thing." Jasper looked at him, eyes narrowed, but thoughtful. "You mean acting?" "I mean living," Clint replied. The words landed like bricks wrapped in velvet. They sat in silence for a moment. Comfortable, this time, not competitive, not performative. Just two men who had spent most of their lives being heard, finally finding a space where they didn't have to say much at all. Clint tilted his head toward the faint hum of music coming from the green room. Noise is easy, stillness takes work. Jasper nodded slowly. He was starting to understand. Jasper leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor. Clint remained still beside him, his gaze off in the distance like he was looking through time. "You ever get tired of people expecting you to be one thing?" Jasper asked quietly. Clint smiled just slightly. "Only when I forget, I'm not." Jasper let the words sit. He'd spent so much of his career declaring who he was, screaming it through lyrics, interviews, award show monologues. He fought for the mic like the world was a courtroom, and he had 5 minutes to deliver a closing argument. But now, in this moment, he wasn't fighting. He was listening. "You know," Clint said, "when I was your age, I thought I had to say everything I felt, out loud, to prove I was worth hearing. And now?" Clint shrugged. "Now I let the work speak." Jasper looked over. "And the piano?" Clint nodded. "That was for me. But if someone else needed to hear it too, all the better." It hit Jasper in a place he didn't know he'd been guarding. All his performances, all his words, they were about impact, message, ideology. But they weren't always about connection, not like this. "You don't have to be loud to be heard," Clint said. "That's the trick. Art speaks louder than you think if you let it." Jasper leaned back, absorbing that. It wasn't a sermon. Clint wasn't trying to teach. He was just sharing, and it made all the difference. No defensiveness, no rivalry. Just a quiet man with a long memory and a deeper well of experience than Jasper had given him credit for. "You're not what I expected," Jasper said finally. Clint looked at him, eyes sharp but warm. "Neither are you." Another silence, this one even better than the last. And in it, Jasper felt something new, not small, not defeated, but opened. He realized maybe the best thing he could do tonight wasn't to speak or perform. Maybe the best thing was to listen. And in that quiet hallway, just outside the noise, just beyond the spotlight, he finally did. The green room wasn't the same. The crowd had thinned. The buzz, the clinking glasses, the shoulder taps from industry names, it was all gone now. Just empty wine glasses on end tables and chairs, left slightly askew like echoes of people still lingered where their voices used to be. Jasper stepped inside, slower this time. No swagger, no smirk, just the quiet weight of the night pressing against his chest. He crossed the room, his boots softer now, less eager to be heard. The baby grand sat where Clint had left it, still open, still glowing under the overhead lights, like it remembered. Jasper lowered himself onto the bench. He let his fingers hover over the keys just like Clint had. He pressed one note, then another, soft, unsure, then stopped. He sat there for a moment, his hands frozen mid-air, the silence around him deafening in its clarity. He tried again, just a few bars of something half-formed, a melody he used to play when he was hungry and unknown, and the music hadn't yet become part of the brand. But it didn't land. Not like Clint's had. He felt it immediately, the difference between noise and truth, between performance and presence. Jasper let his hands fall to his lap. The keys stayed silent. It wasn't that he couldn't play. It was that, for the first time, he realized how much he'd been playing at something, not from something. He looked around the room, the chairs, the velvet curtains, the empty champagne flutes, and the piano, still open, still humming with the ghost of Clint's hands. Jasper closed the lid gently, not out of defeat, out of respect. He stood, slid his phone from his jacket, and walked toward the exit, his reflection flickering across the glossy black finish of the piano as he passed. He didn't need to play right now, he needed to think. The morning sunlight poured through the kitchen window like it was trying to be gentle. Jasper sat at the counter, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. He hadn't posted anything since the show. For once, the noise of the internet felt like something to approach carefully. He opened Twitter. His drafts were full of half-clever quips, sarcastic jabs, the usual armor. He deleted them all. Then he typed, "I tried to roast Clint Eastwood and got a masterclass in music, presence, and restraint. That man's the real deal." No emojis, no hashtags, just the truth. He hovered for a second, then hit tweet. The response came fast and loud. Retweets by the thousands, comments piling in, verified accounts praising the humility, fans quoting his words. Someone even posted a clip of Clint at the piano, grainy but golden, captioned with, "This is what class looks like." Another user wrote, "We don't make legends like this anymore." And under it, hundreds agreed. Jasper kept reading. One reply stood out. "Respect. This is how you evolve." He smiled softly, not for attention, not for clicks, just to himself. Because last night hadn't been about losing face. It had been about finding something old, something true. And now the world knew it too. The lights were lower than usual, intentional. No pyrotechnics, no video wall screaming his name, just a single spotlight over a Steinway on an empty stage. Jasper Quinn stepped into it slowly, his boots making the kind of sound on wood that only happens when an audience holds its breath. He wasn't dressed loud tonight. No designer trench coat, no ironic pins, just a black button-down, sleeves rolled, and the quiet confidence of someone who had learned when not to speak. The crowd wasn't screaming, they were listening. He slid onto the bench and adjusted the mic, clearing his throat. "This is a new piece," he said softly. "It's a little different." A few murmurs rippled through the theater. Phones were lifted but less aggressively than usual. They sensed something in his tone, something they weren't used to. He looked out over the crowd, then down at the keys. "This one's for an old cowboy who showed me how to speak without saying much at all." The words settled over the room like dust over vinyl, and then he played. Not fast, not polished to perfection, but honest. The notes fell like conversation, soft, measured, with that late-night jazz curve that dips into your chest before you know what it means. He leaned into the silence between each chord, letting the pauses do their work. It wasn't a song built to impress. It was a story, a memory, wrapped in melody. Backstage, Clint stood just inside the wings. He didn't move, didn't blink much either. He wore the same black blazer, hands folded behind his back. A quiet observer in a world that usually turned too fast to notice the things worth watching. But tonight, he watched. And he smiled, not a grin, just the subtle curve of a man who recognized something rare, a moment unfolding without the need to control it. Jasper finished the piece with a delicate chord progression that trailed off like a sentence unfinished, as if he knew that some things didn't need to resolve. The crowd rose slowly to their feet, not a roar, just warmth, real and earned. Jasper stood, nodded once to the crowd, then turned toward the shadows. Clint was already gone, But the moment, it stayed. Just like the music, just like the lesson. Full circle. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even crazier.